Hey, Uncle Mark.
Uh-huh.
You know how we were raised in a cult?
Yeah, I sure do. I mean, I never think about it, but now that you bring it up.
You know what?
It's so funny. I shied away from the word cult for Mormonism for the longest time, just because it feels too big. And I know that one of the definitions of a cult has to do with just how demographically large it is or small it is. But for the most part, I think it's pretty culty. But it's not. Yeah. But it can. But the version that we had, the downtown Mormonism.
Yeah.
The Brighamite Mormonism.
Your city Mormonism.
Yeah. Your workaday Mormonism. Not as culty as some other offshoots.
At least they were desperate not to appear so. And,
it may not be as culty as some, but it's definitely cult adjacent.
Oh,
yeah.
It was a cult. We were raised in a cult.
Yeah, we were.
However, it could have been worse. And Uncle Doug, I think you're here to tell us all about that.
I am indeed. And well, Uncles, it has become my private goal to try and prevent this podcast from going full Mormon. You never want to go full Mormon. Yet I seem to be the most...
Or really any Mormon at all.
I seem to be the most serial violator of that mission. So when two very weird, very sad stories connected by our strange little desert cult hit the wires, I decided that rather than split them into two separate segments, I would cram them into one segment and get them out of the way.
Okay.
So longtime listeners of this show know that your dear uncles can often find ourselves getting lost down ever stranger and darker rabbit holes. But even with that said, strap in.
Are we going to issue a warning here that, Doug, there is an extreme level of violence in this?
I will when we get to that point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Be warned, listeners, and it will include, I'm sure there'll be a mention of violence against children.
Yeah, well, when we get to that point, I will definitely issue a trigger warning. And a little bit of a trigger warning for the beginning here, but this has been in the headlines, so it's not going to surprise anybody.
Look, consider it. You don't have to do another one. It's just warning. There's a trigger. There are going to be triggers all over.
Well, there's about 30 seconds.
It's a story about Mormonism. Children are going to die. That is just. Please fucking just get used to that as a thing.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah.
Let's start it out. The first story in this sad and tragic murder of 9 Americans, 3 women and 6 kids in northern Mexico on November 8th, so just a couple weeks from when we're broadcasting.
Right.
The Mexican authorities have yet to identify the attackers, but it appears to be a criminal group called La Linea, which is currently at war with elements of the Sinaloa cartel, and that this group of Americans was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were traveling in a caravan of 3 SUVs, which in hindsight seems like not a great idea in cartel country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The details are terrible. The gang stopped the caravan, and when one of the mothers got out to show them that they were a group of families, they shot her at point blank in front of her children, and then they opened fire on the SUVs and set them ablaze, killing the 9. One young boy managed to get out and get a bunch of kids and hide them under a bush until the gang left.
Oh my
God. Very sad story. But it turns out that this group of Americans are an offshoot of Mormonism that still practices polygamy. And the reasons that they found themselves in Mexico trace directly back to the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, and the Stalin of Mormonism, Brigham Young. Mm-hmm. So, as we have covered many times on this show, back in 1830 in upstate New York, a very shady and very horny young man named Joseph Smith founded the Mormon religion based mostly on a crappy knockoff of the Bible, whose principal claims were laughably disprovable at the time of writing and have not aged well. Joseph, you see, was here to chew bubblegum and fuck minors, and he was all out of bubblegum. So, as Fawn Brody put it in her seminal biography of Joseph, no man knows my search history. He was No Man Knows My History. Great book.
Yeah.
He was too much the Puritan to just simply fuck his way across the Midwest. He had to find a way to make it holy. And wouldn't you know it, he found a loophole in the only book his family owned, a King James Bible, big enough to cram a girl on the eve of turning 15 through. Fortunately for Joe, many of the Old Testament prophets were polygamist. Solomon even famously had 700 wives and 300 concubines, which Joseph considered a good start. And so, although the exact date is disputed, as early as 1830, Joseph began taking plural wives. His first victim, and being a 14-year-old girl staying with the Smiths as a paid servant, she was most definitely a victim, was Fanny Alger, but she was just the beginning. At first, Joseph kept all this secret, including from his wife, and he kept it to kind of his innermost gaggle of fellow lechers. He even took to sending his good friends on multi-year missions abroad so he could secretly marry and bed their wives that he'd taken a fancy to. Really good guy.
Well, but it's a good ploy.
It worked.
Yeah.
It was effective.
It's good to be the king.
It's good to be the king. Finally, under some pressure from the increasing number of people who Joseph had wronged by fucking their wives and daughters, Joseph recorded a revelation known as Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, that lays out in great detail how and why polygamy not just should, but must be practiced by good Mormons as a fundamental prerequisite to entering the kingdom of God. This section is still on the books to this day.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the most brilliant thing about Mormonism right now is how much current Mormons are like, we don't do that. That is not a thing we do.
How dare you, sir?
And yet, if you're like, well, but is
Can I borrow your book?
Yeah. Can we look at that for just a second?
So subsequently, an angry group of men killed Joseph in 1844, as we covered back in episode 96, mostly because of polygamy. And Brigham Young then took the church out of Utah, outside the boundaries of the United States, as we covered back in episode 97, mostly because of polygamy. So polygamy and all the baggage that comes with it is as old and fundamental to Mormonism as is the Book of Mormon and mayonnaise, and is simultaneously the source of its greatest power and its greatest weakness. Without the motivation of polygamy, rapey fanatics like Brigham Young, Parley Pratt, and John D. Lee would have found some other avenue for their devotion and their semen, and Mormonism would have probably faded into the obscurity of the burnt-over district. However, without the stain of polygamy, the modern Mormon church would be far more powerful and dangerous than it already is. So, anyway,
they're in a real pickle.
They're in a bit of a pickle.
It's a conundrum.
Pickle here. Yeah.
Once Brigham realized that there was no escaping the manifest destiny of the United States, he set about trying to get statehood. However, the federal government was uncompromising in its stance that polygamy has got to go. And so Brigham's second successor, Wilford Woodruff, officially banned polygamy in 1890 with a manifesto, by the way, which is a little more tepid than a full revelation. And Utah was granted statehood 6 years later. That's not the end of the story, though, as several splinter groups broke from the church in order to continue their inbreeding programs. Many of these groups decided to continue the long tradition of fleeing the United States in order to keep fucking minors, with several groups fleeing north to Canada, where they can still be found today, and several heading south to Mexico, which brings us full circle to the tragic events of November 8th, and how a group of fundamentalist Mormon polygamists found themselves in cartel country.
Yeah, let's not forget that the initial caravan of Mormons leaving the Midwest to come to Salt Lake City was them fleeing the country.
Yeah.
This was Mexico at the time.
To continue to practice polygamy.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Interesting little side note here. In one of those polygamous colonies in 1907 in Chihuahua, Mexico, was born a bouncing little white baby named George Wilkin Romney.
Yep.
Father of failed presidential candidate and current spineless Utah Senator Willard Mitt Romney.
That's right.
Willard. Can we just call him Willard, please? Because that is a terrible name, and I love it.
However, the victims of this gang that died the other day were members of the LeBaron sect of splinter Mormons, which ironically was its own kind of crime syndicate back in the 1970s. Local listeners will no doubt recognize that name because it was all over the news at the time. The then leader of the sect, Ervil LeBaron, the most Utah name in history.
Yeah.
Ervil
LeBaron ordered the killings of several rivals based on another horrid Mormon belief, blood atonement, that Uncle Mark covered back in episode 50. I feel like this podcast is collapsing on itself.
Yeah.
Eventually it will go supernova and we will start a cult. We will all be cult leaders.
The Mormon singularity will occur.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So Ervil was sentenced to life in prison and died in prison in 1981 in the Utah State Penitentiary, which brings us to the second Mormon story of the day about another murderer who died in that self-same penitentiary only days ago, Ronald Watson Lafferty. Ron Lafferty had been on death row for 34 years for the brutal murders of his sister-in-law, Brenda White Lafferty, and her 18-month-old daughter, and that he committed along with his brother Dan in 1984. Ron had just recently lost his last appeal, and a date for his execution was being set when he died.
Oh, I didn't know that.
What was the method of his execution? Any guesses?
Firing squad.
That's right. Fucking firing squad. Because this is Utah, and we're not just going to hand over the title of craziest state without a fight.
I actually like that we do firing squad.
Well, we don't need more.
Oh, that's right.
So he had he got
No, I actually think that if I were being executed, I would choose firing squad over other things. I think it's pretty humane.
When they said aim, would you just start
romantic
wiggling?
anyway?
Yeah,
Yes.
right. So his brother, pardon me, his brother Dan tried to kill himself during the original trial, and so their trials had to be split. with Ron receiving the death penalty and Dan getting life in prison. Dan is also incarcerated at a different section of the same prison. So the story of the murders is as horrific as it is bizarre, and is told in incredible detail in John Krakauer's 2003 book, Under the Banner of Heaven.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. If you have not read that book, I cannot recommend it highly enough if you want to understand the violent underculture within Mormonism. The Lafferty family was based in Utah County, which is the true locus of the Mormon faith. In what at the time and place was actually a pretty modest progeny, the family consisted of the parents and just 6 brothers. That's a pretty small family for 1970s Mormonism.
Yeah.
They were always pretty fundamentalist, but somewhere in the late 70s, brothers Ron and Dan took things up to 11. They began attending a heretical group with some other fundamentalists called, modestly, the School of the Prophets, that aimed to steer Mormonism back to its roots, which of course means polygamy.
Right.
Yeah.
There was one problem, though. Youngest brother Alan had married his sweetheart Brenda, who by all accounts was pretty opinionated and headstrong, not exactly 2 attributes welcomed in fundamentalist Mormonism.
Or fundamentalist anyism.
Anyism, exactly. As Ron and Dan tried to convince their brothers and their brothers' wives to take up polygamy, it was Brenda who led the resistance, eventually banning them from her house and forbidding Alan from attending the School of the Prophets. So, even though she was the youngest Lafferty wife, she was she was the one the others depended on to stave off the rising tide of stupidity. But as Ron became more fanatical, he became abusive, and it was Brenda who convinced Ron's wife to leave him and take their 6 kids and flee. Around the same time, Ron and Dan's abusive behavior and beliefs proved too much even for Mormonism, and they were excommunicated. So, now fully isolated, they started getting weird. And I mean really weird.
Now they're getting weird.
Exactly.
Yeah, if you want to see a cult reveal its true self, push it out into the wilderness for a while.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
They bought shares in the Dream Mine that Uncle Mark covered back in episode 75. They stopped paying taxes and registering their vehicles, joining the predecessor to the sovereign citizen movement. Mm-hmm. They started receiving frequent revelations, which Ron started believing that his need to evacuate his bowels were promptings from the spirit. Yeah.
Well, I mean, how else do you know?
Hey, man, everything happens for a reason.
I've had some pretty amazing bowel movements, so I don't know.
Yeah. Those are blessings from the Lord.
He has. I've been there.
For every one of them.
Been there holding my hands.
As the poo doula.
One time it's true. We'll talk about that another time.
Sure. God, will we?
Yeah.
They became obsessed with the legend of the One Mighty and Strong, which is a prophecy uttered by our old friend Joseph Smith back in 1832, while Fanny Alger was still a sex slave in his basement. The prophecy goes, quote, "It shall come to pass that I, the Lord God, will send one mighty and strong, holding the scepter of power in his hand, clothed with light for a covering, whose mouth shall utter the words, eternal words, while his bowels shall be a fountain of truth to set in order the house of God."
Did you just say his bowels?
His bowels shall be a fountain of truth. There's your bowel.
Let me tell you something. A bowel fountain is never a good thing. There's no time when that's an okay thing.
That was a pretty shitty cruise. I agree. So this prophecy, along with the White Horse prophecy, which we covered back in episode 68, still motivates young and dumb Mormons to this day, and it got the Lafferty Bros all a-frothing. There is one anecdote of them stopping traffic in an intersection as they did push-ups to demonstrate their might. But all the cardio in the world wouldn't shake the realization that their family was gone, their church had kicked them out, they were unemployable, they were in trouble with the law, and the further they went into their beliefs, the worse their lives got. And you know what? It was all that bitch Brenda's fault. And so coincidentally, Ron received a revelation in early 1984 that Brenda, her 18-month-old daughter, who would grow up to be just as much of a bitch as her mother, and 2 other people had to go. So this leads us to July 24th, 1984, Pioneer Day, which is kind of the most sacred day in Mormonism, especially in Utah County.
I don't know about sacred, but
celebratory.
Celebratory, yeah. It's our state holiday.
Yeah. So here's the trigger warning. The next minute or so of this podcast are very gruesome, and I am not kidding. If you were distressed by even a sanitized description of violence, you should skip ahead a little bit. So the 2 brothers had picked up a couple of drifters to help fund their impending getaway, and although not participants in the murders, they knew full well what was to come and would end up being important witnesses in the prosecutions. Ron and Dan knew that brother Alan would not be home. Ron approached Brenda's house, knocked on the door. When she opened the door, he forced his way in, followed soon by Dan. Over the next few minutes, Brenda fought hard for her life, putting up a fight that caught the 2 brothers by surprise. They severely beat her, tried to strangle her with a vacuum cord, but when she wouldn't give up the fight, They finally slit her throat and let her bleed out on her floor. During the ordeal, she begged only for the life of her daughter. Then Dan entered the baby's room and, by his own account, apologized to her for what God was making them do before slitting her throat so severely that she was effectively decapitated.
Ugh.
Yeah. They then headed to the next person on the list, Chloe Lowe, a friend of Brenda's, who was mercifully not home at the time. On their way to the final victim, they missed the turnoff to Richard Stowe's house. Stowe was the bishop who excommunicated the brothers. And instead of going back, they decided they had better get out of Dodge, and they headed to Nevada. The two were arrested in Reno on August 17th. In a trial that garnered national attention, the two brothers, now being tried separately because of mentioned Dan's suicide attempt, were found guilty and sentenced. Ron and Dan have remained unrepentant all these years and have maintained that they were only carrying out God's will. Mm-hmm. I am saddened by Ron's death only because I don't believe in hell, and I was hoping for a firing squad with terrible aim. His brother Dan, by all accounts, is suffering from the same health problems as his brother, so this sad, creepy, and violent chapter in Utah history might finally come to a close soon, and when it does, we will surely let you know.
I just feel like, look, your God sucks.
Big time.
If your God made you do all this shit, you had a miserable life, and then the last half of it is just going to be spent in prison. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a shitty God.
Yeah,
you failed at God.
And if you're a prophet, how did you miss the turnoff to the guy's house?
Exactly.
You're a fucking idiot, is what you are.
You would think that God would provide a sort of celestial GPS to help out, but
yeah, I mean the more detailed accounts of these two brothers, they're pretty fucking dumb.
Yeah, they're
pretty fucking dumb. Can I circle back one sec, Doug, to just so people understand a little bit more about the Mormons that were killed in Mexico? The problem is not that they were directly challenging the cartels. That's not what is understood, right?
No, they were not at all.
Where they landed in the 19th century has now
become the cartel territory.
Exactly. They're in the borderlands where the cartels try to move a tremendous amount of shit across the border to meet American demand for drugs, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it's just a series of accidents of history that they are where they are.
Yep.
And it's funny because most of those those sort of Mormon cult groups, they are American citizens.
Most of them have dual citizenship.
Yeah. So they could just cross the border and live here, except that they have this polygamous thing going on, so they can't because that's criminalized here in the States.
Exactly. And it is just I guess the question is for religion in general and Mormonism in particular. What part of either of these sad and violent stories was made better by their religion?
Yeah.
Right?
None.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at least they get an eternal reward after they die, they think. So, sorry for that bummer, guys.
Fresh planets for all my friends.
That's right. You get a planet, and you get a planet, and maybe not you, but you get a planet.
You just hope that Muhammad doesn't come along and break it in half. I guess that's the lesson.
That would suck.
To take from this show this week. So, all right, well, with all that murder over with, let's move on.